All right, my name is Dr. Jesse Ciccotti, and for this installment of the ChinaSource Conversations podcast, I have been invited by ChinaSource to interview Dr. Joshua Brown. Dr. Brown completed his PhD at Dayton University in 2016 and is now assistant professor of theology at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. Dr. Brown is a specialist in comparative and systematic theology, working primarily with Hans Urs von Balthasar and Thomas Aquinas, as well as early Ru or Confucian philosophy. And as your CV states, you're competent in 10 languages. That's not a small accomplishment and relatively unusual in the US. Last year, Dr. Brown published a monograph entitled Balthasar in Light of Early Confucianism, which we are here to discuss. He has also co-authored another book with Alexis McLeod that also came out last year, published by Bloomsbury, entitled Transcendence and Non-Naturalism in Early Chinese Thought. So welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
In spite of worldwide troubles we're all familiar with, 2020 seems to have been a pretty productive one for you. So congratulations on that point.
Thank you very much.
Today we're talking about your new book, Balthasar in Light of Early Confucianism. But before we get there, our listeners would probably like to know a little bit about you. Would you talk a little bit about your theological and philosophical training? How much of it was in Chinese traditions, and how did you get interested in Chinese philosophy in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, great to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the interest in the work. That's always great. So I think that question is easiest to start with how I got interested. I like to say I kind of backed my way into this kind of academic career in a certain sense because I grew up Southern Baptist and I was grew up in rural North Carolina. Never really had a terribly great interest in Chinese philosophy or anything like that until I met the woman I would marry. She's from Malaysia. She's Malaysian Chinese. And so getting to know her, I found myself caught in this really weird world of, we didn't have Christmas trees, but we would have Hongbao and we'd have other things for Qinjie or Chinese New Year and Zhongqiujie or Mid-Autumn Festival. Like I began to celebrate these yearly with her, learn how to speak Mandarin and Cantonese very slowly and very poorly, of course. And that really is the seed of that interest. And when we began to have kids, and we're talking about having kids, she wanted the children to have a strong Chinese identity, cultural identity, and I thought that was very important as well. So it became the question of how do I be a father to kids in this situation. And then about when I went to get my doctorate in theology, and a couple years in the program, when it comes time to write your dissertation or get the idea for it, I also became Catholic. And so there was this very strange mix of, I'm new at being Catholic, I'm new at living in a Chinese cultural home, and I have no idea how these things make sense together. So I figured write a book about it, try to figure it out that way. So that's really how I got interested in it. Yeah. In terms of training, I would say at Dayton, I was very lucky. I think this is providential. That we happened to have a young assistant professor there in the philosophy department at Dayton. I wasn't in the program with him, but he happened to be there, and he was, as you know, Jesse, uniquely open to like theological kind of readings of Chinese philosophy. And he was so that's Alexis McLeod, who I co-wrote my book with this past year. He was my way in to Chinese philosophy. He was such a patient teacher, and formally and informally. And then from that, of course, meeting lots of other good friends who've helped lead me into the light, as it were. So yeah, somewhat informal backgrounds, but yeah, that's how I came to do this stuff.
Great. So then, transitioning from the Chinese side of the comparison here, how did you become interested in Balthasar?
Well, so I attended Campbell University Divinity School in North Carolina, and that was when I really first began taking theology seriously as a discipline, and read broadly and many other things. And one of my theology professor that I was really close to, Cameron Jorgensen, he happened to he was an expert in Balthasar, but he liked Balthasar. And so I happened to just pick up some Balthasar stuff and read it. And at first I liked it because I didn't understand it. It was very difficult for me to follow. So I thought it'd be a nice challenge to try to understand what he was up to. But I was also just intrigued. So he has this like really wonderful theology of beauty, and
Mm, yeah.
calling us to, as he says, one of his books titles, "Love Alone is Credible," right? So believing in the God who loves us, kind of thing. And um, I don't know, somehow it spoke to me, and I wanted to find out more about Balthasar. So I was into Balthasar way before I even thought about studying Chinese philosophy, which is ironic because now I'm much more known for working in Chinese philosophy than for Balthasar.
Yeah.
But hey, yeah, so that was always there.
Great. Okay, so in the book, you critically read Balthasar's claims regarding Christ's filial obedience to the Father through the lens of the early Ru or Confucian concept of filial piety or Xiao. First, it might be helpful to refresh our listeners' understanding on the Chinese side of things. You spend 2 chapters in your book on the Confucian concept of filial piety or Xiao. Would you define and unpack this concept for us?
Okay, so the short version, I guess, right? So Xiao is fascinating. It's been blamed. It has a tough career in modern language, both in the West and in Chinese traditions, as being this attitude of complete obeisance to authority figures, right? So subservience, in other words, is how that works out. Or is often associated with the ancestral sacrifices, ancestral veneration practices, and those things are true to a degree. But I argue in the book, at heart, what Xiao is really about is it's kind of like the things that being a child of a parent requires you to do, right? If you take being a child seriously and we want to live that out, live that identity out, that's what being Xiao is, right? And there are some rules that govern what that proper action looks like. Things like ancestral sacrifice in early China.
Uh-huh.
But at the heart, that's really it. It's being a good child, playing the role of being a child to one's parents. Um, so the way I put it in the book is technically, the way I try to find it is, you could think of Xiao as the virtue of having deep affection, love, and reverence for your parents, and then expressing that love or enacting that love in acts of obedience, but with qualifications here and there. Right? It's not so much just straightforward subservience, but it's seeking the parents' good
Mm-hmm.
in love. I
Yeah.
guess that's what Xiao is.
Yeah, great. So, would you share a little bit about the metaphysical aspects of ritual in Chinese traditions? I think it's commonly claimed or assumed that Chinese philosophy does not concern itself with such questions, that it's more concerned with, quote, the mundane aspects of life, if you will. How do you address that in relation to xiao and to li, or ritual, in the Confucian tradition?
In some ways, that's a tough question because you'd have to, which the Transcendence and Non-Naturalism book actually meant to address some of those concerns, like about like why, especially Western readers, would tend to assume there isn't a kind of metaphysical or rich, almost transcendental flavor to what's going on in Chinese thought. Um, so, not rehearsing all of that, also be say, Michael Pewitt, for example, at Harvard University, has shown really well like that the idea of the ancestors, right, it invoked this kind of multi-layered aspects of the divine and spirits and how they work in the world. And um, you certainly have the almost a kind of spiritual theistic kind of context in early China that's always there, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, the difficulty for Confucianism or reading it is that it often Confucius himself is famous for saying this, like, it seems to suggest that you have to take care of the human first before you can figure out the spiritual, or almost as though like you have to figure out the human role as a response to what else is going on.
Yeah.
And for that reason, people often interpret it as being kind of agnostic or unconcerned with the divine.
Mm-hmm.
But I argue if you have a broader lens to these things, you actually can realize there's a lot of really deep, robust spiritual, theological elements. So very briefly, one thing that ties into Xiao, I think helpfully, are things like in the Zhou dynasty in China, the ruler was called the Tianzi, right, the son of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's often overlooked in this is that one reason for the title, I should say, is that only the ruler was to be the proper sacrificial agent towards Tian, right?
Right.
So you have this kind of sacrificial, religious, filial identity all wrapped into one. Uh, and even like I think Mark Edward Lewis talk about this. He's a historian of early China. He writes that the people who tried to undermine the Zhou leadership in Confucius' time, one thing they did was try to actually usurp the ritual roles that the emperor played, right?
Right. Right.
So you actually have a very deeply religious sensibility going on in the background that often doesn't show up explicitly in all these texts, but it's definitely there.
Yeah. Okay. So now looking at the other side of the comparison, you are looking specifically at the idea of the obedience of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to God the Father, through Balthasar's writings. What drew you specifically to this idea, maybe prior to seeing the correspondence with the Chinese side of things?
So on the one hand, I knew going into my program at Dayton, I kind of wanted to write about Balthasar's Christology, that is the study of Jesus Christ. And when I determined I wanted to do Confucianism as a way in, so I had to find a couple of angles. One option was, for example, Balthasar writes a book called one of his major works is Theological Aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So could you find a way to make Confucian aesthetics work in the Balthasar? Someone could, but I'd always been kind of fascinated by the idea of filial piety itself, especially, I was, going to be a father when I wrote the dissertation at first. And for Balthasar, people will observe one of the most central themes in his theology is the obedience of the Son. Now we would talk about the various reasons why that is so central to him. But that's really the heart of how he thinks about who Jesus is. It's his mission as the Son and obedience to that mission that identifies the who of Jesus. So in that sense, it just struck me as just a very natural kind of a way to go about it. And in part, I just felt really drawn to that kind of question.
Yeah, great. So looking at the book as a whole, how did you come to this comparison? You've got the Chinese aspect of Li and ritual and filial piety, Xiao, and then Balthasar's theology of the obedience of Jesus Christ. Often I find there's a human element or a story behind the pursuit of a research question. Was there anything in particular that kind of an aha moment or something you were reading and you realized that these things really came together nicely?
It's interesting. In some ways, I feel like almost I had to will it into existence because, but I guess partly for me, it was when I began to seriously delve into these matters. I became continually frustrated at some comparative readings because they seem to always just stay at, saying what the differences are. And I really wanted to work towards grafting Chinese philosophy into what Christian theology was doing. Like something like what Justin Marwer talks about with talking about the Plato and the Greek philosophers as the seeds of the word, right? Or Balthasar's own image, he talks about this kind of mosaic of truth, and like every stone has its place, right? You just got to find it. And so in that respect, I kind of just wanted to find the stone, find the place to put the stone of Confucian wisdom in there. And so in a certain regard, the way that would flesh out is Francis X. Clooney is a very important comparative theology scholar.
Yep.
And he writes about this the process of rereading, like reading your own tradition in light of another tradition.
Yeah.
And so it kind of just came to me that it would work really well to see, instead of trying to do a full laboratory kind of experiment and go on, we have this very solid kind of control variable in Balthasar. And what would it be like to introduce this new element and use that as a way to figure out how it can fit in?
Yeah.
So that was really the real genesis of it for me, is figuring out that I wanted to use Balthasar as this kind of testable guide to almost as a lever, right, to kind of figure out how and where you can place the Confucian stone in its place. Right?
Great. I love that imagery. So, in the interest of time, we're not going to delve deeply into your interpretations and explanations of either the Confucian tradition or the details of Balthasar's works. I would like to focus primarily on the final chapter, the comparison proper, so that our listeners can grasp the overall work and your particular contribution to theological studies through it. So, in your book, you seek essentially to do three things, as you state. The first is affirm some of Balthasar's insights into Christ's obedience. The second is to challenge some of Balthasar's proposals. And the third is to expand Balthasar's account of Christ's obedience. All of these using the concept of Xiao, or filial obedience, through the Chinese tradition, or the Confucian tradition. I'd like to look at each of these in turn. So first, you affirm two major points of Balthasar's account of Christ's filial obedience. The first you call the performance of sonship. Would you explain what you meant, or what Balthasar meant by that?
Well, I guess so. The idea of performance of sonship, I think, is my way of trying to name the commonality between the two. So I'm not sure if I blame him for that. But so essentially, what that gets at is both Balthasar and early Confucianism seemed to me to say and agree that sonship is not simply a biological status, but it's also more or less a moral status. It's something that is you have to actually enact and perform. So I'll give the listeners a contrast in the story of the prodigal son, right? We have the story where the son asked for his share of the father's of the share of the inheritance. So some interpreters will argue that when he does that, he's actually saying, I wish you were dead, Dad, and rejecting his place in the family,
Yeah.
which is also why he doesn't have the ring or the robe or things that identify him as part of the family. So in that sense, you can say the prodigal son, he is a son, but he refuses to enact his sonship. He refuses to live out that identity, right,
Mm,
as fundamentally important for who he is.
mm,
Whereas with Balthasar, for him, Jesus's sonship, uh, like that is who he is. That is completely who he identifies himself with, right? So at the center of Jesus's self-understanding, self-consciousness, is a sense of him being the son, not the hero or not the miracle worker per se, although he does, certain things, right?
mhm.
But it's that role as a son.
Yeah.
And similarly, Confucianism, we have this idea of being the son as this kind of universal role that touches everything, that shapes and governs how you should live your life.
Right. Okay, so allow me to ask a speculative question. How might an early Confucian react to observing Christ's obedience in view of their concept of Xiao?
Well, I mean, suppose like, and so on one hand, this is the difficulty of thinking in those terms because certainly Jesus doesn't do some things that a Xiao son would be expected to do. So, for example, we don't have an image of Jesus mourning whenever his parents die. So, like, there's nothing recorded about Joseph when he passes. Of Jesus mourns for 3 years, for example, which is or 25 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Certainly, there's no, at least a way the Confucian would see it, no kind of ancestral sacrifice that goes on, and that's important because ancestral sacrifice was the most important act of filial piety. Um, and even like you could say, we like Luke tells us the most about Jesus's childhood, but it's not obvious that from those stories, right, that we have a clear sense of what obedience looks like that the Confucian would recognize in the home, right? So some of the markers just aren't as obvious, right? Uh, but if you have the imagination to place Jesus, think about Jesus in like the Jewish analog of what those things are, right? Um, Certainly in Luke's gospel, you get the sense that he wants to emphasize that we have here the son who is like in the temple, finding himself like, this is my father's house, right? I must go there.
Mm-hmm.
And the Gospel of John, understanding himself as the son, doing the father's will consistently, perpetually. Um, those are the ways you could, like a Confucian could, in a different way, see a very similar attitude of filial piety or xiao, even though it wouldn't look the same.
Yeah, great. So in the second affirmation of Balthasar's positions, you present a compelling linkage between Xiao and Ren, often translated as benevolence, in Christ's obedience. I particularly enjoyed your connection of the Confucian idea of love with distinctions, ayo chadang, transposed onto the son's love for the father and for the world. Would you briefly describe the idea of love with distinctions in the Confucian tradition and how that affirms Balthasar's insight?
Yeah. So here I'm essentially dealing with the conception of things according to Mengzi, especially in like 3A5 when he has debate with the Maoist Yizhi, right? So for those who are interested in Mengzi, that's where that is. And so the Maoists, we need not worry about whether he's right about what the Maoists believe or not. Some would suggest he misrepresents them, but whatever. For our purposes, like so he kind of presents this idea of the Maoist usually talks about we have to have love without distinctions, and Mung's at least seems to push back on that as a kind of idea that you should have love for everyone the same way no matter what, and not treat them or think of them differently regardless of their status to you. Right? Mm-hmm. But Mungza thinks it's really important that you love certain people differently because they're closer to you. That there's kinship bonds, clan bonds that are actually important, and that in another chapter of the Mungza, he talks about this idea that we kind of start loving people within the home. We love our parents and our brothers and our sisters and family, and then we have this tui, like kind of a radiation in which the love in the home, like Xiao, for example, is kind of pushed out in like larger circles of influence. And so, in other words, the love we have within the home trains us to be able to love others outside of it and give them the care and love they deserve. They are due, you could say, right?
Right.
Or a Christian way, we say they're due that. So in that sense, you have like the Xiao, which is a kind of love with distinction. You love your parents differently than you love, Joe Blow down the street. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that love with distinction and also what allows you, gives you the resources and the capacities to properly love Joe Blow down the street with Ren Love, with humane love, as you could say, right? So that was the Confucian idea. And then applying it to Christ, it was the sense of Balthasar, I think, rightly tries to give on priority to the son's love of the father, right? And I talk about this link between the son's love ad patrum, that is to the father, and then the son's love pro nobis, that is on our behalf, right?
Yeah.
And what I wanted to emphasize there is just like Mengzi thinks that you have to have the love with distinction in the home that allows the radiation of love for others to happen. It's like we have the triune love of the son for the father that kind of spills over and is able to extend out and encapsulate the entire cosmos in the world. Right? So there's actually a relationship between the priority of the son's love for the father and his love for us. Mm-hmm. That was, I was trying to.
Yeah. Much of the book works from the Confucian tradition, expanding or further developing Balthasar's theology of Christ's obedience. In other words, moving from the Confucian to the Christian. But in this section of the book, you moved in the other direction. On page 176, and I'm going to read a little bit at length here, you say, "We cannot say that Jesus loves us in the same love with which he loves the Father. As the cross bears out, Christ can take the cup of suffering in love for the Father, ad patrum, but not on behalf of the Father in the way he does so for us, pro nobis. Thus we can say that Jesus' Ren for us is distinct from his filial love. Yet we also know it flows from it as an extension, tui, of divine love. Of course, the great difference that Mengzi could not anticipate is how in Jesus, Xiao and Ren would be perfectly united. This is not merely because Jesus perfectly loves the Father and us. It is also because his love for us, Ren, is an economic mode of God's love for the world and the human love for the Father as the incarnate Son, Xiao. Hence, Ren is manifest not simply in dying for the world, but in calling the world to also become sons of God. His Ren is rooted in his Xiao and enables a new form of Xiao to arise in the hearts of those who love him. I think this is one of the great applications of your book and an important interpretation for Chinese Christians who value their cultural heritage and seek to join it with their spiritual heritage. I'm curious, have you received any response from Chinese Christian readers to this particular insight, or even maybe your wife? Or would you like to expand on it a little bit or apply it to Christian living, whether Chinese or not?
Well, okay, to the first part of that question, no, I haven't received much feedback about from any readers in general. I welcome feedback from especially Chinese Christians about these kind of things. I hope it has some ability to give expression. I mean, for me, that's like the goal is to enable a kind of harmonization or reconciliation between cultural identity that I think is rich and beautiful and vibrant, and the faith, which also is rich and beautiful and vibrant. Right? So I haven't, but I hope maybe some of the listeners can email me or something. That'd be great. Okay, can you repeat the second part for me? I lost track of it for a moment there.
Would you like to expand on what you said there, or apply it maybe to Christian living today, and how Christ's Ren, rooted in his Xiao, enables a new form of Xiao to arise in the hearts of those who love him? So, as Christians, what does that mean for us in Christ's obedience to the Father, and then that us becoming sons or daughters of God? What does that mean for us?
Well, we'll see. I think just off the top of my head, and as a teacher of undergraduates, comes to mind. So certainly today we have, I think what C.S. Lewis would call the rise of Christianity, and where we think Christianity is terms of how much it serves other kind of projects, and like things like social justice are one of them, right? So the idea of benevolence for others, and those things are important, but there's also the sense in which we may lose the importance of the fact that the end of the game is for us to become children of God, to become the adopted sons and daughters of God, and there's a place for the social concern. Like, I'm gonna do it this way. Ren, benevolence, right? It's one of those kind of things that makes us think about the moral life, like living for others, right? Which is very, very important for Christians. But Christian charity should be primarily about loving God, right, as the ultimate highest good, right? And then it's that love of God which enables that love for the other to be perfected and brought into harmony with the true order of goods. This is a very Augustine kind of point. So I think you'd almost like being Ren without being Xiao is deeply problematic, right? Being Ren or thinking Christianity is a kind of being Ren activity without understanding it's also being introduced into a new kind of family, a divine family in which we are given responsibilities and roles, and we have things to do, not just for the world, but also for God, for others, for the church itself, right? I'd say that's one thing off the top of my head I would add in there.
It really strengthens Christ's statement and question, what is the greatest commandment? It's to love God. And what is the second is to love others. And and there's a priority there. There is an order. There is a greatest and there is a lesser, but only slightly lesser commandment to love others. But they do come in that order.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also, especially with this way, I like Meng's ideas so much. It's also that the idea that the Xiao love informs and anchors what Ren love is and could be, right? So one thing I find deeply problematic today is this kind of appeal to amorphous, formless kind of ways of loving others. When really, Christian charity is about calling to, and I think the Confucian Ren as well, to a large degree, loving others so as to seek and will their good, will their flourishing, right? And to do that requires the purification of heart and things that come through, in the Christian language, being the cultivating the Xiao for God, right? So yeah, unless we get that part right, it seems to me that we teeter on the brink of getting the Ren part wrong.
Yeah. Without going too far on a philosophical tangent that I'm sure you and I would really enjoy, but maybe the rest of our listeners may not be able to follow. In philosophical circles, it seems like there's much more emphasis paid to the idea of Ren, and maybe this is following a Kantian influence of like this universal that applies in all cases, all the time, as opposed to a particular, which would be Xiao. But you're reversing that. And you're saying we need to work on Xiao. That's the priority, and Ren is something that follows from that, or is Tui is extended from that.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say, I think part of this is because Ren is very amenable to the kind of trends we find, like a globalization and things, right? Like, the idea of tolerance, or you can make that work with Ren pretty well. You can universalize it.
Yeah.
But when you talk about Xiao, I mean, Xiao is in part about treating others morally, but it's also about rituals and how they function, right? So it brings a lot of other baggage that modern people don't like that much.
Yeah, right.
But
Right.
which
Bring in the transcendent, you've got to deal with some other things that doesn't fit kind of a secular perspective.
yes, I think that's a very good way of putting it. Which is another good reason to remember the Xiao and Ren linkages in Confucian tradition, right? That even Ren, even social concern is not simply a kind of let's be nice together, right? It's part of a comprehensive way of thinking about what it means to live your life well, right?
Yeah.
That includes parts that, yeah, modern folks may not like very much.
Right. So your second major contribution is the challenges that the Confucian concept of Xiao poses to Balthasar's claims. The first challenge is to the idea that the son was abandoned by the father at his sacrifice on the cross. This has been argued against in Balthasarian studies, as you note, on the basis of theological conclusions, but not on logical consistency in Balthasar's expounding on Christ's obedience as the son, which is what you take up. Can you explain the logical problem briefly that Balthasar faces and how Confucian Xiao corrects this error?
So essentially, you could say people will argue that Balthasar's conception of the son being abandoned by the father is theologically wrong, as in like, well, we can't hold to that, right? Um, but what they don't do is push back and say, okay, what is it about the logic of the sonship at stake that Balthasar has that becomes problematic? And so what I argue is that if you invest, as Balthasar does, in the centrality of the son's obedience and mission, like so the son is the perfectly obedient one to the divine will. He gives himself completely, utterly, like he uses the phrase like absolute poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus completely gives himself over to doing the will of the Father, right? And I say, so then you create the problem of what kind of father abandons this sort of son, right? So I contrast it helpfully to the story of King Shun in Monks of Five, book five, I should say. And so you have this passage where King Shun goes out and he wails and weeps in a field because his parents don't love him. They even tried to kill him a few times. Poor guy. And what we have there is that we have a genuine moral and value disagreement between Shun and his family, right? So Shun is abandoned, but it's because his father is just morally decrepit, and he doesn't like Shun is virtuous, but his father is not. And they part ways, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea that Jesus is the virtuous son who really fulfills his Xiao perfectly, right? And yet it's still abandoned. It's like you have to explain why the father goes through that, right? And ultimately, what you have is this kind of sense. Well, I think as I put in the book, the father would have to abandon the son because sin requires it, but it's not a real abandonment, right? It's like a kind of sleight of hand. In which case, I'm like, why we have to have the abandonment anyway, right? So it's more like to say that if we take the centrality of the son's identity as the son and he's perfect obedience, then Confucian logic says actually he wouldn't be abandoned, right? The father would not, like a virtuous father does not turn away from a virtuous son in that way, right? Right. So we have to have some way of accounting for, like, if it's true that the father does abandon the son on the cross, we have to have some way of accounting for that. And I know someone would say, like, he takes up the sins of the world. But it seems like a very, like, he formally then speaking, he kind of denounces the son, but it's not a real denunciation, not a real abandonment. It's just for the sake of the show, right? Mm. So that critique is in essence, a way of saying, I don't think the Balthasar's emphasis on the son makes sense of his claim there. And so I'm open to being proved wrong about this, but I'd like someone to kind of explain how that leads into the actual abandonment of the son.
Sure. Okay.
So that may be a bit too in the weeds, but
No, that's okay. I'm sure there will be some listeners that really get into that. The second challenge that you present is to Balthasar's position that the son is eternally obedient to the father. That seems to have a ring of truth in it. Would there ever be a quote time that the son is not obedient to the father if the father-son relationship is itself eternal? How does the Confucian Xiao correct this error?
well, I mean, so on the face of it, you could say that it has some appeal to it. Part of the issue with that position is that, and Karl Barth also has the idea of the son's eternal obedience, and he actually uses a word that's like very almost a no-no in Trinitarian theology, which is like subordination, right?
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
this is like, for those of you readers who may know, there was a very famous heresy from Arius of Alexandria, which talks about the son being different in substance from the father and also subordinate to the father, right?
Yeah.
And so this is part of the problem with using language of eternal obedience. Okay, so if you have eternal obedience, that means you also have this eternal difference between the authority of the son and the father, right?
Mm.
And it also suggests, which some have tried to argue this is not the case, but I don't find it very convincing. It also suggests you have two distinctive wills.
Right.
So you have the father has a will and the son has a will in eternity. And of course, this leads to the question of, okay, so in what sense is it the one God who's the three persons, right? So generally speaking, you have the what we call the ontological or the being issue, which is, you seem to have multiple substances in God, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also maybe call it tritheism. Or you have the issue of subordination, which also implies a kind of improper differentiation in God. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so to get at where the Confucianism comes in helps, I should say this. What Balthasar and people like Barth are trying to do, if I appreciate, is they're trying to say that what theologians call the economic Trinity, and that is the way that God, the Trinity, shows up like at the baptism of Jesus, in the world trying to save it, right? The economic Trinity shows us what we call the immanent Trinity is like. That is the inner life, eternal life of God is Trinity. So they want to have linkage between that, and of course that makes perfect sense. But what Balthasar tries to do, it seems, is to take the obedience of the Son in the realm of salvation and working out on the cross and things, and say that that's an expression of the eternal obedience. Right? There has to be a continuity of act between what goes on in eternity in the Trinity and what goes on in the economic Trinity. And so what Confucianism gets you is that it offers you just a way to distinguish between the kind of affection of filial devotion
Mm.
and the acts of obedience, so that whenever the possibility that the circumstances arise in which you must act a certain way to be obedient, right, the son can do it. Well, that's distinct from his devotion, his love for his parents, right?
Mm.
The reason that's important is because it is possible to say that there is this eternal community of love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? That's not debated at all in the Christian tradition. Um, and so essentially what I'm saying is, by thinking about Jesus as Xiao, the Son is Xiao, you can say he has the eternal affect or disposition or virtue of love
Mm-hmm.
within the Trinity with the Father, that whenever he becomes flesh, he takes up the enactment of obedience. He begins to perform it in forms of obedience. So we don't necessarily have to say the obedience itself is eternal. We just say the obedience is an expression or modality, you might say, of that filial love,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in other words, it allows us to avoid the messy language of obedience because it ties into subordination, all those kind of things, but without losing those insights.
Okay. Great.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that's
Yep.
sensible.
Yeah.
Sense,
I was particularly struck by your use of li or ritual for expanding Balthasar's theology of Christ's obedience.
Mm.
What would seem like a natural comparison between various Chinese rituals and Jewish cultic rituals found in the Torah becomes something much more rich when explained in Christological filial sonship terms. And you speak of three different forms of ritual engagement: The first is Jesus' own participation in Jewish cultic rituals that are focused on the temple. The second is Jesus' ritualized practices and forms in his public ministry. And the third is Jesus' suffering, beginning with the Last Supper, which is itself a part of the Jewish ritual, and ending with his crucifixion. So, beginning with the first form of engagement, Jesus' cultic rituals focusing on the temple, would you briefly recount the key intersections that you mentioned? And then I will follow up with a question.
Okay. So yeah, essentially, it's one way of saying, okay, what do you do with this fact that the temple is very important to the Jewish people, clearly, and also has really important places in Jesus's ministry, right? And this is, some scholars will read Jesus's treatment of the temple as a kind of a way of his moving past the Jewish tradition or something like that, right? So the way Jesus acts towards the temple is somewhat controverted among scholars, I suppose. Um, what I found interesting was you have all these, especially in Luke's gospel, right? You have when Jesus is born, right? The Blessed Mother Mary and Joseph take him to the temple for circumcision for Mary's purification rites. You have clear testimony of the pilgrimage to the temple, right? Annually, it seems, for the sacrifices that would take place there. I mean, this is inherently part of what's going on. If you've ever read Brent Petrie, he'll talk about like the Jewish context of the Last Supper, for example, that the citation of the Passover lamb, it shows a deep familiarity from Jesus with the actual sacrificial systems going on in the temple area. So one way is to try to make sense of, okay, so you have this house, this temple worship stuff. How you make sense of it? And it shows this kind of ritual center to Jesus' life, right? That he was not just a spiritual kind of person, right? He was a deeply religious person, right?
Yeah.
One way this maps onto Confucianism very well, I think, is when Jesus throws out the money changers. So I liken this to passages that talk about King Wen from antiquity and King Wu, who and Duke of Zhou, who would repair the ancestral temple for sacrifice every time they had a chance, right? So we have Jesus, like similarly, like having a house of worship that's in disrepair, in a certain sense, morally in this case. He says, you made my father's the worship into a den of thieves, right? So he kicks people out in order to restore the temple to what it really is, right? And so as a Confucian way of seeing things, this looks very strikingly to the kind of upkeep of the ancestral temple, like making sure the ability of the rites to take place are maintained. So I guess that's the general answer, right? Is that it's kind of like the Confucian imagination would point out these things, say, "Holy cow, these things are there. I didn't notice them."
Yeah, great. So a follow-up question for that then is, what might be the implications of this aspect be? What might the implications of this aspect be for the New Testament teaching that the community of believers, the church, is now the temple? Maybe from a Chinese perspective, or just what insights do the Chinese bring to this so that we can incorporate that into our theology?
Well, certainly. So we could do some more discussion instead, I suppose, about in chapter 3, I think, in the book, I talk about the ancestral sacrifices, and there's always this preparation stage, right, where the Xiao son repairs the temple, like actually, it nails it back up and sets everything out and makes sure everything is ready to go, right? So when we think about the idea of, the sacrifice of ourselves to God, like the oblation of ourselves, right, as part of the priestly act that we all have now to Christ, and this is the temple act, you could say. To what extent do we think about that as like a prepared kind of ritualized kind of act, as opposed to just a kind of moral, well, okay, I'm going to think about turning my life over to you. Are there ways in which we can actually think seriously about what it means to have a seriousness, or the Chinese word for this is like almost like anxiety, like deeply concerned about how we're prepared to do this act of giving ourselves over to the Lord.
Yeah.
And I think also another issue would be it'd be interesting to think about this in terms of like Hebrews, right? The high priest who always makes sacrifice on our behalf, right? I love the idea of the Son, the high priest in heaven, making a perpetual sacrifice for us, and inviting us into that. And think about that as also a filial act,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, it's not this like, we're gonna sacrifice to God, sacrifice ourselves to God because we want to make him pleased, so he doesn't zap us with a lightning bolt or something. But it's this, we get to make acts of filial devotion and sacrifice ourselves, and or as and I'm a Catholic, so the priest sacrificed the Eucharist, for example. We do this as a part of our devotional love of God, and
Yeah.
kind of beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So regarding the second form of engagement, let me ask a missiological question.
Okay.
One of the greater phenomenological contrasts between Protestants and Catholics is the use of ritual in worship. In its most reduced form, in some Protestant circles, there are only two rituals that are maintained: baptism and the Lord's Supper. Contrast that with Catholic traditions, which are much more ritually robust. The former perspective, the Protestant perspective, allows for more flexibility and adaptation and the development of new rituals particular to a cultural context, whereas the latter, the Catholic, seems to provide a consistent structure across cultural and even linguistic lines, so that even in a foreign context, someone might feel spiritually at home. Even if they don't know the language, they know the form of the ritual, so you know when to stand, you know when the Apostles' Creed is recited, or other um, regular rituals within Catholic traditions. So do you favor one or the other, or a mix somewhere in between, and why?
Oh, do I favor one kind of ritual model, you mean?
Something more reduced in terms of, just baptism and Lord's Supper,
Mhm.
in contrast with something much more ritually robust, um, liturgically, and other types of things. There's Protestant traditions with a stronger liturgy framework, but I want to try and
Right.
draw as much of a contrast as possible, and
Okay.
just let you fit yourself in there somewhere.
Well, so certainly, as a Catholic, how about this way, there are, the Confucian tradition kind of distinguishes between two kinds of rituals. So you have Chuli and Yili, right? So there's like minute rituals, which are like everyday kind of things we do.
Mm-hmm.
There are the big ceremonial rituals, like sacrifices and things. I'm all down for ceremonial rituals. I think they're very important as part of the life of the church. And they have a, we not get to the theological argument where they come from, I suppose. But um, I, I do think the ceremonial rituals are inherently part of what it means to live a Christian life, and they're really, really important. And I think the having the basic structure, having the liturgies structured for that is important for the common life that we have. Like, especially this is where the Xiao thing really does help, right? Um, Being brought into the adoption of sons, right? To see the liturgy as a kind of performance of sonship. It's not just like what I think it should be. It's like there's this ancient wisdom, ancient tradition of living out that sonship, and that's what liturgy is for most Catholic and Orthodox Christians, right? It's this way of connecting to and living out the sacred tradition
Mm.
from the apostles. But I will say also, one thing I loved about writing that section of the book was, in the back of my mind was always this that YouTube video that became really famous a few years ago about the guy who, the spoken word piece where it's like Jesus came to give us what, God, but not religion. Like, so there's this, like,
Mm-hmm.
I grew up evangelical, and there was always this like way in which we'd associate like the rich or religion with the Pharisees. So we didn't think we were doing religious stuff, right?
Right.
Um, but like I have like an uncle who's a pastor, and he moved the communion table one Sunday at his church, and everybody freaked out. It's like, no, we actually do have rituals that govern our lives, even not liturgical traditions do.
Right.
They may be more in the Chuli than the Yili kind of rituals,
Mm.
but they're there, right? And in other words, I think there's to notice that Jesus has a ritualized religious sensibility frees us to say, you know what, it's okay. Like, we actually, in as much as religion is kind of a natural phenomenon, right? Grace perfects it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Christianity, because we're human, it is going to involve a kind of religious ritual elements, right? And the question is, to what degree are those being made vessels in communication, or where are they transmitting grace and participating in that? So part of it was to help Christians say, you know what, it's okay. You don't have to like think about yourself as being unreligious, right?
Yeah.
Embrace that part. That part, it's there anyway. You know, might as well embrace it and let it structure how you are. And I
Yeah.
think the Confucian esteem of that is really, really important.
Yeah.
But we can't live without these things that govern, how we order our common life together.
Yeah.
And Jesus comes to help us with that,
Yeah.
among other things.
Yeah. And if you worship in Chinese Protestant churches, you will find very strong ritual, and it's very, very important to the Chinese believers. That structure is ingrained in them culturally, and that kind of thing.
Uh, so if you want to figure out if you're religious, like you're religious or not, like in a ritualized sense, go to a church of a very different cultural background from yours, and you'll figure out very quickly that you do expect things to go a certain way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Good. So the third point of expansion of Balthasar's theology is Jesus' sacrifice. I love how you tie together Jesus' priestly role with his filial role, and we touched on that briefly earlier, particularly supported through the book of Hebrews. It's not really a question; it's more just a comment that I appreciated how you tied those together. And you already did expand on that a little bit. Is there anything else you would like to say about that, or we could move on to?
Well, I mean, I guess in part, I would say in general, I do think there's a tendency among, especially Western Christians. Um, we inherit not only the Christian tradition and respect, you also inherit modernity and all of its hangups, right? And so, like, there's a thing like John Adams, for example, he would talk about going to a Catholic mass, and he said he understood why people could be seduced by it because of all these bells and whistles. It's beautiful stuff, but it's like, but when you got to the clean air, you realize, it's okay. You don't have to believe that stuff or something. In other words, I think there's a suspicion of ritual as though it somehow is opposed to
Mm,
authentic, genuine devotion and love,
mm,
right? Um, and I think in Jesus we certainly find evidence that this doesn't seem to be quite the case, right? That you have Jesus filling out this filial obedience and love for the Father on the cross that also was a priestly act, right?
mm,
So it actually the lead of the Christian tradition are like the Confucian tradition. Confucian tradition. They're meant to be tied into and expressions of this kind of deep love and devotion. And it's almost like we do a disservice when we attempt to separate them too much.
mm.
We tend to think of our devotion as being able to be disembodied,
Right.
right? Whereas Confucianism is like, no, you have to find ways to embody what you love, right?
Yeah.
And as a Catholic, I'd say like that's what the sacraments are, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mass and also the other pieces of devotion that we have, right? They're all about ways of embodying the love and also finding that, like, calling us into a more perfect kind of love and devotion for God.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, is kind of what comes out of that reflection on Christ, filial priesthood.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Filial priesthood. I like that. So last question for you. Right at the end of the book, you say, by analyzing how Christ's filial identity is expressed in various ritual ways, one can see that Jesus' life conforms to the Confucian ideal. Although it was not the goal of your project, are there ways in which Christ's life of filial love and filial obedience challenge Confucian accounts of filiality? Or are there aspects of Balthasar's theology that does the same? So this is going kind of in the other direction.
Well, that's actually a great question. I mean, I will say part of what I want to do with that is you have a lot of, especially modern China, people like Xiao, who was the founder of the party in China, or one of them anyway. He talked about Xiao as that which left China, behind, right? Left it in a weak, subservient position to be exploited by imperial powers. So, Xiao actually has had a bun rap in modern in modern literature a lot. And so, and part of that was that we wanted to call attention to this kind of the beauty of the ancient Chinese idea itself, right? As a way of thinking about the virtuous life, and especially the life of the Lord led, and how we can come to adore Him, and especially those from a Chinese background who are called to be Xiao, or think about being called to be Xiao in their life. to think Jesus as a model for that. Jesus challenged it. I mean, yes, certainly in several respects. So there are some unsavory aspects of Xiao, right? Um, and some deep issues such as, you know, I talk about this in the book. What do you do when your father is an immoral person, right? How do you be Xiao to someone like that?
Yeah.
Um, and the Confucian tradition itself, apart from the ruler being the son of heaven, doesn't really emphasize that much the idea of filial piety being given towards the divine, right? Even though there is a robust conception of Tian as a divine kind of figure, or Shangdi in some traditions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like it doesn't think about that part as much. But Jesus certainly challenges us to recognize God not simply as a kind of important force that governs the universe, which is, you know, Tian, very much so that in like Mengzi, for example, but as someone we actually owe filial devotion to, right? Who has a family, the Jewish people, and has called us to be part of that family in the new covenant, right? Um, I think that definitely changes the game and asks us to reimagine what, you know, in a certain sense, what being filial means, what our human relationships mean, like the status they have for us. Um, it certainly challenges the way that we can think about being within a certain family as like an ultimate matrix of meaning for us, which it was in early Confucianism. Jesus does change the game in that. And I think so that poses a fascinating question, while also I think giving room to bring in the best of what Confucianism, you know, has to offer, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to ask more follow up to that, we can talk more about that. But
That's great. That's great. That exhausts my questions for you. One last question, I guess. What was your favorite discovery while writing the book?
well, I would say one of them is like, this is how academics think about things. I struggled a long time with getting the last chapter to work. I was able to talk with a friend, Reed Lachlan in Toronto, and he was very, very helpful in, you know, helping me figure out how the rereading kind of stuff would work. So in a certain sense, as a theology nerd, it's like figuring out how to make the thing stick, make it all work together.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really great, fun thing.
Yeah.
In terms of the things that I found out, the thing that lasts for me is, you know, reading the Confucian tradition on sonship, I began to, on the one hand, think more and more about myself as a son and
Mm.
the deep failings that I've had, and, you know, think about how the modern West has trained me to be a son and what that means. To have all these conflicts show up that I didn't know how to deal with. You know, so when we take the Confucian tradition seriously, I felt the crisis a little bit. But then thinking about Jesus in terms of taking Confucian tradition seriously, um, it gave me a way to read these stories, which I've read since I was, you know, 6, 7 years old. You know, it generally let me read the Bible in a completely new way, right? And it was like read as like, or is it G.K. Chesterton talks about the in Orthodoxy, the man who thinks he discovered England or thinks he discovered New World, but he discovered England, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like that, like rediscovering where I was the entire time.
Wow.
And seeing it with fresh eyes really, for me, set ablaze a new kind of fire, a new kind of passion, appreciation for the faith that I maybe perhaps grow too accustomed to sometimes.
Hmm. Great. Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Brown. That concludes our interview with Dr. Brown and his book, Balthasar in Light of Early Confucianism. Really grateful for your time, grateful for your insights, and Xiao on continuing to write and research in Chinese theology.
Oh, 谢谢.